He was once the face of American television, a man millions admired and trusted. Richard Chamberlain, the actor who defined elegance and perfection on screen, has passed away at the age of 90. But while the announcement of his death was quiet, almost hidden from the world, what came after was anything but ordinary. For decades, Chamberlain was known as the ideal leading man, calm, refined, and untouchable. He kept his private life sealed shut, never letting scandal or controversy taint his image. Yet in death, the very silence he guarded so carefully was shattered. When details of his final will emerged, the world discovered secrets that no one had expected. Assets worth millions went not to family but to strangers and causes he supported in secret. And even more strangely, questions began to surface about the mysterious circumstances surrounding his final days. It seemed that Chamberlain, who had built a career on playing roles of clarity and control, left behind a legacy of unanswered questions, a puzzle that continues to fascinate fans and critics alike. But how did the perfect man on screen become such an enigma off it? And why did his final choices stir so much shock and debate? The answers lie in a life lived between light and shadow. When Richard Chamberlain's death was first announced, it barely made a ripple in the media. A few lines in the papers, a brief mention on television, and that was it. There was no grand farewell, no elaborate memorial, no official statement from Hollywood's elite. For a man who had once dominated the screen, his departure was strangely quiet, almost too quiet. But just days later, the silence was broken in the most unexpected way. His longtime attorney in Honolulu revealed the existence of a will, drafted only months before his passing. Inside those nearly 40 pages was a decision that left both fans and relatives stunned. Chamberlain's estate, valued at nearly $20 million, was not directed toward his blood family. Instead, it was largely funneled into a little-known arts organization called the Pacific Light Foundation. To the outside world, it seemed baffling. Why would one of television's most recognizable faces leave his fortune to a group few had even heard of? The surprises didn't stop there. A significant portion of the estate was left to Martin Rabbit, Chamberlain's former partner and companion of nearly 3 decades. Though the two had lived apart since 2010, the will referred to Rabbit as someone I once loved deeply and always cherish. With that single phrase, Chamberlain not only confirmed a long-speculated truth about his private life, but also made it legally undeniable. Rabbit inherited a villa in Maui, joint investment accounts, and a share of the remaining assets. For Chamberlain's estranged relatives, however, the document was a devastating revelation. They had expected, perhaps even counted on, being included in his final wishes. Instead, they were written out entirely, not even a token acknowledgement. Analysts who reviewed the will agreed. There were no loopholes, no vague clauses, no room for dispute. Richard Chamberlain had been clear, deliberate, and unshakably firm about where his legacy should go. And it was in this sharp, almost cold certainty that the first cracks of mystery began to appear. Official reports stated that Richard Chamberlain passed away peacefully at his home in Waimanalo, Hawaii, after complications from a stroke. On paper, it seemed simple, a natural end to a long life. But those who followed the story closely couldn't help but notice how unusual the announcement was. Unlike most Hollywood farewells, there was no funeral for the public, no press conference from family or close colleagues, not even a statement from former co-stars. Instead, the world learned of his death through a single, brief notice issued by a friend, and then silence. The lack of detail immediately sparked whispers. Fans questioned why there was no ceremony to honor an actor who had defined an era of television. Reporters who reached out to relatives found that most either declined to comment or admitted they knew very little themselves. For a man of Chamberlain's stature, the secrecy surrounding his final days seemed almost out of place, as though something was being hidden. Speculation grew online. Some suggested that the secrecy was deliberate, a continuation of Chamberlain's lifelong desire for privacy. Others went further, wondering whether there was more to his passing than the sparse details revealed. Was his health decline more complicated than anyone admitted? Did he choose to keep the truth from the public, even in death? The absence of clarity left a cloud of uncertainty, one that fueled more questions than answers. In the end, the mystery of Richard Chamberlain's death may never be resolved. Perhaps it was nothing more than a man staying consistent with the values he lived by: discretion, silence, and control over his image. But for those left behind, the unanswered questions have only deepened the intrigue. And as the details of his will began to spread, the sense of enigma surrounding Chamberlain's final years only grew stronger. For Richard Chamberlain's family, the shock of his will was not entirely unexpected. In truth, the distance had begun decades earlier. Nieces and nephews admitted in interviews that they barely knew him at all. Attempts at reconciliation over the years often ended in silence. Unanswered letters, ignored phone calls, and visits declined at the last minute. One niece, who once worked in education, even confessed she wasn't surprised by her uncle's decision to exclude the family altogether. "He lived the way he wanted to," she said, and this just reflects exactly that. Legal analysts interpreted the will as more than just a document. They saw it as a symbolic statement. By leaving his fortune to outsiders and charitable causes, Chamberlain seemed to be sending a message to his relatives. Blood alone wasn't enough to earn a place in his life. Whether this decision was born from bitterness, indifference, or a simple desire for independence remains unclear. But the exclusion cut deep, leaving relatives not only without inheritance, but also with the painful realization that they had been absent from his heart long before his passing. Public opinion quickly split into two camps. Some argued Chamberlain had every right to decide where his money went, especially given the lack of meaningful connection with his kin. Others saw it as an unnecessarily cold move, a final rejection that stripped his family of both wealth and dignity. On social media, debates raged. Was this a man standing by his principles or a celebrity abandoning his roots? What no one could deny was the consistency. Richard Chamberlain had spent his entire life controlling his image, distancing himself from controversy, and keeping his inner circle painfully small. In life, he was a man of silence. In death, he remained just as guarded. But to understand why he lived this way, one has to return to the height of his fame, when he wasn't just a television star, but a cultural symbol of an entire generation. In the 1960s, Richard Chamberlain became a household name almost overnight. His role as the compassionate Dr. Kildare on the hit medical drama didn't just win ratings, it defined an archetype. For audiences across America, Chamberlain wasn't just another actor. He was the image of morality, responsibility, and quiet strength. His soft-spoken manner, sharp features, and calm presence made him the television doctor every family trusted. The kind of man people believed embodied the best of American values. That breakthrough role opened the door to a string of prestigious projects. From the sweeping historical drama Centennial to the epic miniseries Shogun and the Thornbirds, Chamberlain became a fixture of primetime television. He was the star audiences could rely on, always elegant, always poised, always in control. Casting directors knew exactly what he represented. The perfect man, the flawless gentleman, a figure of stability in a world that was rapidly changing. The media embraced this image wholeheartedly. Chamberlain was consistently portrayed as discreet, cultured, and free from scandal. Tabloids that thrived on gossip and rumors had little to report about him. Unlike many of his contemporaries, his name was never dragged through the mud, and his reputation remained untarnished. To the outside world, Richard Chamberlain seemed untouchable, the embodiment of dignity and restraint, a man immune to the chaos of Hollywood. But perfection is rarely the whole truth. Behind the polished exterior and carefully guarded public persona was a man carrying secrets that, if exposed, could have ended his career in an instant. The same qualities that made him so compelling on screen, restraint, elegance, and silence, were also tools he used in his personal life, hiding parts of himself he believed the world could never accept. And it was this hidden battle that defined the real Richard Chamberlain, far more than any role ever could. At the height of his fame, Richard Chamberlain lived with a fear that most of his adoring fans could never have imagined. In an era when Hollywood demanded its leading men appear rugged, masculine, and unquestionably straight, Chamberlain carried a truth he could never reveal. He was a gay man in a world that had no space for him to be one. To protect his career, he constructed a perfect shell. Every appearance, every interview, every public smile crafted to uphold the illusion that his personal life mirrored the roles he played on screen. During the 1980s, while his career soared, Chamberlain quietly began sharing his life with Martin Rabbit, a screenwriter and actor who would become his partner for nearly 3 decades. The two built a home together in Hawaii, far from the flashbulbs of Hollywood. Yet, despite the depth of their relationship, they lived as shadows to one another in public. There were no acknowledgments at events, no candid photos in magazines, no official confirmation of what was, in truth, the most important bond of his life. Chamberlain once described the feeling of being trapped in a carefully constructed mask. Everything about him, his clothes, his speech, his mannerisms, had to match the image of the dignified, straight-leading man. Even close friends and family were kept at a distance, left guessing about the truth. He feared that even a single misstep could unravel everything he had built. For decades, silence became both his protection and his prison. It wasn't until 2003, at the age of 69, that Chamberlain finally broke the silence with his memoir, Shattered Love. In it, he acknowledged openly what had long been whispered in Hollywood circles. He was gay, and Martin Rabbit had been his partner for years. To some, the revelation came as a shock. To others, it was merely a confirmation of what they had suspected. But for Chamberlain, it was an act of release, though one that came late in life, after the height of his career had already passed. After the release of Shattered Love, Richard Chamberlain found himself at a crossroads. Though society was gradually becoming more accepting, he no longer felt the need to prove himself in Hollywood. Instead of using his memoir as a springboard for a new public role, he chose to step away. He gave fewer interviews, accepted only minor acting jobs, and steadily withdrew from the industry that had once defined him. For a man who had spent decades under relentless scrutiny, the retreat was both an escape and a declaration. He no longer owed the world his image. By the early 2000s, Chamberlain had settled almost entirely in Hawaii, trading the glitz of Los Angeles for a life of quiet seclusion. His home overlooked the ocean, a place where he could finally breathe without worrying about appearances. Friends described him as courteous and thoughtful, but increasingly private. He rarely attended industry events, politely declined public engagements, and instead poured his energy into small personal pursuits. For the first time in decades, Richard Chamberlain was free to live without the constant weight of Hollywood expectations. His relationship with Martin Rabbit, though deeply important, eventually faded. By 2010, the two had separated. Though they never lost touch completely, their bond, forged over decades, remained in the background of his life, even as Chamberlain chose to live alone. He never sought another partner, and those close to him believe it was not out of bitterness, but rather a decision to remain independent. In a way, his solitude reflected the choices he had made his entire life, guarded, deliberate, and always on his own terms. In his later years, Chamberlain became almost invisible to the public eye. He devoted his time to reading, playing the piano, and contributing quietly to local cultural projects. Neighbors described him as reserved but kind, a man who seemed content with silence. Unlike so many celebrities who clung to the spotlight until the very end, Chamberlain walked away willingly, leaving behind only fragments of himself for the world to see. Yet even in his quiet retreat, his influence would continue in unexpected ways. Though Richard Chamberlain had stepped away from the cameras, he never turned his back on the arts. In fact, it was during his years of seclusion in Hawaii that he became most influential, though in a way few people ever knew. Quietly and without fanfare, he became the driving force behind the Pacific Light Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to nurturing young talent in theater and the arts. For more than 15 years, Chamberlain funneled donations into the organization, always under the condition that his name remain anonymous. Students who passed through the program recalled a man who was gentle but perceptive, someone who listened more than he spoke. He never boasted about his career or used his fame as leverage. Instead, he offered mentorship in private sessions, helping aspiring actors and playwrights refine their craft. One former student remembered him as a man who said little but saw everything, a mentor whose advice was as sharp as it was brief. For Chamberlain, supporting the next generation of artists was less about recognition and more about ensuring they had opportunities he once feared might be denied to him. It wasn't until after his death that the full extent of his contributions came to light. The Pacific Light Foundation revealed that Chamberlain had been their single largest benefactor, responsible for transforming the small community group into a regional cultural institution. His donations had built classrooms, funded scholarships, and given hundreds of underprivileged students a chance to step onto a stage for the first time. The will that redirected his fortune toward the foundation was not a sudden whim, it was the continuation of a commitment he had carried for years in silence. Friends in Hawaii described this hidden generosity as entirely consistent with who he had become. He no longer craved attention or applause, but he still believed in art, in its power to change lives. His evenings were often spent at the piano, playing Chopin or Debussy, and occasionally hosting small gatherings of musicians or writers. To those in his quiet circle, he wasn't a Hollywood icon. He was simply Richard, a man who had chosen to give in secret, live in peace, and let the world remember him only through the legacy of what he left behind. Richard Chamberlain's relationship with his family had always been complicated, but by the time of his death, it was nearly non-existent. Born into a middle-class family in Beverly Hills, he maintained contact with his parents in the early years of his career, especially his mother, who proudly followed his rise to fame. But as the decades passed, he grew more distant from his siblings, rarely attending gatherings and gradually slipping out of their lives. For his nieces and nephews, memories of him were faint at best, a few childhood encounters and the knowledge that their uncle was a famous actor, but little more. The divide did not seem to come from a single dramatic incident, but rather from years of silence and avoidance. Friends suggested that Chamberlain's need for privacy, combined with the pressure to hide his personal life, made family connections difficult to maintain. Relatives occasionally tried to bridge the gap, sending letters, gifts, even attempting visits, but Chamberlain rarely responded. By the time he released his memoir in 2003 and openly confirmed his sexuality, most of the family had already accepted the distance as permanent. Their reaction to the book was silence. No public criticism, no open support, just absence. When his will became public, the exclusion of his relatives made headlines. But within the family, the reaction was quieter. Some expressed disappointment, admitting the decision stung, while others simply acknowledged that they had expected nothing different. For them, the inheritance was never the real loss. The true grief was the realization that they had been erased not only from his estate, but from his life long before. They weren't just left out of his will, they had been left out of his story. Those close to Chamberlain suggested the decision was not made out of cruelty, but out of consistency. He had always valued control, independence, and distance, and his final choices reflected those principles. To him, family was not defined by blood, but by connection, and by that measure, the Pacific Light Foundation and Martin Rabbit were far closer to him than his own kin. The rift, though painful for relatives, was perhaps inevitable. It was the final chapter in a lifetime of silence, where walking away always seemed easier than confrontation. Richard Chamberlain's will was not just a legal document, it was a statement of identity. By excluding his relatives and directing his fortune toward causes and people of his choosing, he made one final declaration about who truly mattered in his life. For some, it was an act of rejection. For others, it was a rare glimpse of honesty from a man who had spent his entire career hiding pieces of himself. Either way, it cemented the idea that Chamberlain's life had always been defined by silence. Silence in the face of gossip, silence in his family ties, and silence in how he managed his most intimate truths. Unlike many celebrities who leave behind messy battles over estates, Chamberlain ensured there would be no dispute. His language was deliberate, airtight, and uncompromising. Lawyers described the will as virtually untouchable, leaving no room for lawsuits or objections. That clarity reflected his lifelong need for control, the same control that kept him carefully composed on screen and firmly guarded off it. Even in death, he refused to let others dictate the story of his life. But perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't in the money he left behind or the roles he played. It was in the consistency of his choices. Chamberlain lived and died on his own terms, prioritizing discretion over disclosure, independence over obligation. He didn't want to be remembered as a symbol of scandal or as a pioneer of any movement. He wanted to be remembered, if at all, as someone who contributed quietly to art, culture, and beauty, even if his name was never attached. For the public, Richard Chamberlain will always remain a paradox, the perfect man on screen, yet a deeply private figure off it. His departure left behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that was intentional. By refusing to explain himself, he left the world to interpret his life as it saw fit. In the end, his legacy is one of silence, but silence in his case spoke louder than words ever could. Richard Chamberlain lived a life that seemed flawless on the surface, a man who defined elegance, strength, and composure for an entire generation of television audiences. But behind the curtain was someone far more complex, a man who carried secrets, who built walls around himself, and who chose silence when the world demanded explanation. His death may have come quietly, but the aftermath, from his startling will to the unanswered questions surrounding his passing, revealed more about him than decades of carefully curated performances ever did. His true legacy lies not only in the roles that made him famous, but in the consistency with which he lived his life. He valued independence over expectation, privacy over publicity, and authenticity over appearances, even if it meant revealing it all late in life. By directing his fortune to causes and people of his own choosing, Chamberlain showed once again that he would decide the terms, no one else. In many ways, his story is a reminder of the price of living between light and shadow. He was adored on screen, yet alone in many of his private moments. He gave generously to strangers while turning away from family, and even in death, he remained elusive, leaving behind both inspiration and mystery. So what should we take from Richard Chamberlain's life? Perhaps that true strength lies in choosing your own path, no matter how unconventional it seems. Or perhaps that even the brightest stars carry shadows that the world never sees. What do you think about his life, his choices, and the mystery that still surrounds his final days? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story.